what I'm going to do is I want to start off right off the bat because I don't want to waste too much time. Here is an image that I took ever since I moved to Portland. Here, let's go to a brighter version so we can see what we're talking about here. Ever since I moved to Portland, I really haven't had much opportunity to shoot the kind of photography that I absolutely love, and that's this kind of urbex, grungy photography, because there isn't very much of it here on the West Coast. It seems like anytime a building like this gets destroyed or something, they bulldoze it and get rid of it. But this one here has been standing up for some time now. I've shot in it several times, and I absolutely love it because it's just fantastic in terms of what it offers with graffiti, and everything's been burnt down. So the problem is that I took this shot around sunset a couple of months ago, and you can see that in order to get the overall exposure for the brick, we lost exposure in the sun. So the sun's setting right here, and then we have the sky, which we, for the most part, have absolutely no exposure detail for. So what I did was I actually bracketed. A bracket is basically taking several exposures where you maintain the same ISO and shutter speed, or maintain the same ISO and aperture, but you vary the shutter speed. So I was at ISO 100, and you can see here that what I did was I started exposing for the brightest parts of the image first. The camera was doing this for me. And then as we kind of go up, we're starting to get, again, the darkest parts of the image go out of into clipping, and then you get the brightest parts exposed properly. And then you can see how we're kind of varying light, dark, so that now we start getting the really bright shots, and we're starting to get detail over here. Now this is, again, for one of the brightest parts of the image, and this is for the darkest parts of the image. So these are the brackets. These are the brackets that I got with my 5D Mark II. So I'm going to select all of them, and I'm going to do some quick tone mapping using Photomatics. I'm going to go to File, Plug in Extras, and select Export to Photomatics Pro. I'm just going to rename this one really quickly. Now, usually I get a question of, do I usually shoot in JPEG? And the answer is no, I usually shoot in TIFF. I actually will shoot, I will process in a 16-bit TIFF. I shoot in RAW, rather. So the reason why I'm doing JPEG is because it's just faster for the webinar. It doesn't take as long for the computer to process, because I don't want to waste that much time. So what's happening is Photomatics is going to look at all of the images I just fed it, and it's going to try to associate the best pixel values across the whole image. And so what you're left with is kind of like a nice evenly exposed image. So here I'm just kind of bringing this to screen, and you can see what we've got. I'm going to go ahead and hit the default button right here on Photomatics to return everything to factory standards. I do this for the webinars because I think it's important for people who are new to HDR to kind of explore basically how to use these sliders. And by hitting the default button, we reset everything back to factory standards. The other thing I always strongly recommend is using a histogram. So Photomatics has a built-in histogram. You get to it by going to the View menu and select 8-bit histogram. This gives me my luminance value, so I can see if I'm missing any information here. And I can see that I am kind of clipping on the highlights. So if we look over here, this is your standard histogram. Towards the right here, this represents the highlight information of your image, the brightest parts. And on the left are the shadows, and in between are the midtones. Now, if you have any information that's bunching up on either side, that means that you're losing information. So if you're bunching up information on the right, that means you're losing highlight information. And if you're bunching on the left, that means you're losing shadow information. Now, the reason why we're bunching up on the right is because the default value for the white point is cranked up really high. You can see it's a pretty high percentage. Once we adjust that, it'll come down pretty quickly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that strength slider in Photomatics and bring it up to 100%. For these kinds of grungy scenes, I always crank it up to 100%. For landscape stuff where HDR is needed, I usually bring that down to about 85%. And that's just the overall strength of the tone mapping algorithm. From there, right away I'm going to adjust the white point. I'm going to bring that down to about 0.1, and I'm going to bring the black point up. And so if you look, let me bring the histogram back up here. You'll notice now we are not bunching up, which is good. that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to kind of alleviate that. What I'm also going to do is bring up the detail contrast, which gives me a little bit more of an edgier look. And I'm also going to bring up the luminance, or rather the luminosity. So what we're doing here is we're starting to get a really nice even exposure. You can kind of see now everything is looking pretty good. Usually the last thing I'll do is I'll adjust the gamma, or the brightness of the scene. Now, here's a point that I make every single webinar with tone mapping. This is tone mapping, what we're doing here. This is not stylization. Stylization is what you do after tone mapping. So what are we doing in tone mapping? The only thing that we're trying to achieve in tone mapping is to get an even exposure. We're getting detail in the shadows, we're getting detail in the highlights, we're getting detail in the midtones. From there, we can stylize. What I see a lot of people do is this. I see a lot of people take the detail contrast, crank it to 10, and then take the luminosity and crank it to 10. And then you get this like really weird look in the image. You start to get halos on high contrast edges, which never works very well. So I really recommend dropping that down and use other products like the suite, for instance, to stylize. Now, the lighting adjustment, this slider here is basically determining the overall look of the tone mapping. So as you bring it over to the left, you start to get more of a psychedelic look. It tries to smooth out the light accordingly, and the more you bring it to the left, the more you'll start to see halos appear along these high contrast edges. So you really don't want to do that. This is what I think a lot of people do. I shouldn't say a lot of people, but this is what people would do to ruin a good HDR image. And then so they'll save this and they'll post it, and people freak out because you can see you've got a high contrast edge is basically where you have this kind of light color that meets a dark color. And this becomes your high contrast edge, and the algorithm is trying to smooth that out, and it doesn't know what to do, so it figures, let's just brighten it. By bringing that lighting adjustment back to about halfway, you start to get a much more even look. Everything looks normal here. So when we're done, I'm going to hit Save and Re-import, and that's going to bring us back into Lightroom. So here is the image, and watch, let's take one of the original exposures and let's compare them in Lightroom. So you can see, look at the detail in the sky. Just in the sky itself, the detail is staggering. You can barely see anything on the original image, but on the tone mapped image, you see the nice warm color of the sunset. Plus, you see all the detail of the clouds and the buildings. So that, to me, is why tone mapping always has a special place for me as a photographer. Randy asks a question right here. He says, Brian used to take 7 images, and in the last 2 seminars, I noticed you're taking 9. Is it better, or why did you change? Actually, Randy, you're very, very astute, but it's the opposite. For the most part, for the longest amount of time, I was shooting 9 exposures, and that was because I used, at first I was using a Promote Control, a device that allows me to exceed the limit that the Canon camera has. The Canon, I'm a Canon guy, so my camera at the time, the 5D Mark II, was limited to 3 brackets. The Promote Control, which I can link to at the end, allowed me to shoot as many brackets as I wanted. I then later on changed the camera to use a firmware called Magic Lantern. And Magic Lantern is a firmware hack for the Canon that also allowed me to shoot 9 brackets, but without having to connect any peripherals to the camera. Now I use 7 brackets, and the reason why I do that is because I shoot with the Canon 5D Mark III. I upgraded, and that allows me to shoot 7 brackets in camera, so I don't have to do anything, and that's kind of what's going on. To answer your question, is it better or worse? I'm always, depending on who you talk to, Randy, and everyone else, you'll get a different answer probably. For me, each of these shots, to answer another question that gets asked, each of these shots is separated by a 1-stop increment. So there's a 0, -1, 2, 3, 4, and then +1, 2, 3, 4. Usually within that amount of tonal range, I get all of the information I need. I would rather have 9 1-stop increments than 5 or 3 2-stop increments. You know what I mean? So that's kind of what I do there. What was the menu to choose a histogram, Joanne? Go under the View menu in Photomatics and you'll see 8-bit histogram. Do you find Photomatics creates graininess when combining photos? I normally use 3 exposures for HDR. So that's Mark saying that. So Mark, yes, absolutely. So Mark's saying, would I notice graininess if I shot with just 3 exposures versus 7 or 9? Yeah, I do. Back in the day when I only shot 3 exposures, even at a 2-stop increment, I noticed not necessarily graininess. The graininess is really dependent on your camera. So like the 5D Mark II is a 21 megapixel file. So there really isn't much graininess depending on the tonal range of the scene. However, that depends on the camera. What I did notice was once I went from 3 exposures to 9 exposures, the results were 1,000% noticeable for the positive. All right, I'm going to send this image over to the Perfect Photo Suite from Lightroom because I want to stylize. I want to show you what I would do here. I'm going to go to File, Plug-in Extras, and select Perfect Photo Suite to send it over to the suite here. Peter's asking why I don't use the HDR function of the 5D Mark III. So with the 5D Mark III, I have the ability for the camera to do the exposures and the tone mapping. I absolutely hate that for several reasons. One, I don't want my camera to do the tone mapping for me. I want to do the tone mapping myself. And 2, the only format it outputs is a JPEG. So I don't want that. I want to be able to control the output myself. So that's basically, Peter, why I do that. And then a few people, Ken and Ron, are asking whether I save a 32-bit HDR file into Lightroom. With Lightroom 401, we can do that. I don't normally do that, but I'll show people. We'll go into that information in a bit. I've actually never tried it. I kind of like doing it using Photomatics. All right, so let's go here. We'll go into Perfect Effects. Let's do a quick stylization, and then we'll try, because I'm kind of eager now, Ken and Ron, to try that out. For me, one of the first things I do here is I want to go for definitely a grungier look. So I'm going to go over to the Movie Looks category, and I'm going to apply Grunge Goddess. This is an effect that I think was new to to Perfect Effects. Now, the first thing, I noticed actually I have a dust spot right there, which I have to fix. When the image comes in, or the effect comes in at 100%, it's way too strong, so I'm going to bring that down to 0, and I'm just going to bring it up a tiny bit. I don't need that much of it because I actually, it does a really nice job here. So I'm going to hit Add. And then the next thing I'm going to do is add an effect called Fashion Passion. I like actually what Fashion Passion does to the color of the image. But in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the blending options. So for those of you that have Perfect Effects, you might be on the Basic tab. And with the Basic tab, you'll notice we're limiting the functionality. This is more for quick and dirty uses. If you click on Advanced on the top right here, you get this Blending Options button. So when I click that, I actually have the ability to control how that Fashion Passion effect applies to the rest of the image. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to cycle through the blending modes. So something like Multiply, Soft Light, and Hard Light look good. I'm going to go to Multiply. I'm going to bring that down to 0, and I'm going to just bring it up here. Now, for me, I like what the Multiply is doing to the sky, but I don't want it to really apply to the brick or to the walls or to the floor. So watch what I can do here. I'm going to hit Apply to keep that, and I'm going to take my masking brush. For me, when I stylize images, I look at how the effect impacts the overall image, and if it impacts one part better than another part, I'll remove it. So by bringing up the masking brush up here from the tool well, I'll bring my inspector up, and I'm going to hit the invert button. What that does is it hides the effect, and it puts the painting brush into a paint in mode. And what this allows me to do is kind of brush in that sky, the effect, just in the sky. Now I'm kind of going quick here. I don't want to spend too much time with that, but where I'm getting kind of clean edges. But I want to show you what I'm going to do here. So I'm essentially just kind of drawing through here. And I want to make sure that I'd rather paint in more over the border than less, because I don't want that weird halo to appear. Okay, got that. And then let's just kind of close it out. Now let's say you want to see exactly where you've masked. You want to see if you missed any areas. If you go to the Show Mask drop-down, we can go to overlay here, and you can see how right here we missed a few areas. So I'm going to paint those in, kind of get along the edge here, along the edge there, and that makes sure that I get a good clean edge. I also can see that I painted too much into the wall, so I'm going to change my painting mode from paint in to paint out, and I'm going to restore the original, that original layer without the Fashion Passion. Okay, now I can hide that mask, and we have essentially the Fashion Passion effect applied only to the sky, and you can see that we're able to kind of control that now where we want it. All right, so let's hit add. And so here's where I start kind of having fun. One of the things that I want to do is I want to bring out texture to the whole image. But I don't want it to apply to the sky because this wall and the floor usually has a lot of texture. So if we go to the color and tone category, I'm going to scroll over to the right, and one of the last effects, the second to last effect, is called tonal contrast. Now, when I apply that, you can see that, again, it's just way too strong, and we're starting to get degradation in the scene. And the reason for that is because we've got the strength at 100. So I'm going to drop that down to 0 and bring it up very slowly. And you really don't need that much. Something even about maybe 30 to 35% is more than enough. Now, what I don't want to do is I don't want to add texture to the sky itself. I only want texture to apply to the wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this Fashion Passion effect, because the Fashion Passion effect has the mask. Oops. I accidentally dragged around. But as I was saying, the Fashion Passion effect has a mask that only includes the sky. So watch what happens here. What if I want to take this mask and I want to apply it to the tonal contrast? I just go to the masking menu item and I select Copy Mask. And now I can go to the top effect here, go back to the masking menu item and select Paint. Oops, I copied over the mask. Let me do that one more time. Copy mask, paste mask. By doing that, what we did was we essentially applied tonal contrast only to the sky, which is the complete opposite. What I want to do is I want to invert it. I want to flip it so that it's only applying to the wall and not the sky. I can go to masking and select invert mask, and that'll flip the mask around. So now the tonal contrast is applied everywhere but the sky. Sparks is asking how I got the texture from color and tone. So Sparks, color and tone, all the way to the right, the second to last one is called tonal contrast. That's what gives me the texture. Harv is asking a good question. So Harv is saying that if I bring up with the masking brush, check this out. So if I bring up the masking brush, you can see here that I can control the brush size with this slider here. What Harv wants to know is, can I control the size with a Wacom pen? And the answer is yes. I can, under the Wacom controls, I can go to brush size so that the harder I press, the larger the brush is. So the softer I press, the smaller it is, and the harder I press, the larger it is. You can also control the opacity too. All right. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Add, and I'm going to add an effect under the glow category here. Something like probably a Hollywood glow, but a very small amount of it. Because, watch, let me hide that the glow effect for a second. The shot here has lost some of the richness in color. So by adding a glow, we're restoring some of that really nice richness, except you can see how it kind of softens everything. So here's what I usually do. The first thing I do is I bring the strength down to 0, and I bring it up to about 25%. And then I go back to the blending options here. With the blending options, I'm going to go usually to multiply, soft light, or hard light. In this case here, I kind of like soft light. And then I start bringing the strength up again. And so you can see what it's doing is it's bringing this really nice rich color to the image. So if I go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle the before and the after. And to do that, you hit Command P on a Mac or Control P on a PC, and P for preview. So watch, Command P, here's our original. And then this is what we were able to do. Now I'm done in Perfect Effects, so I'm going to hit apply, but we're going to go back to Lightroom and we're going to finish things off in Lightroom. So I'm going to hit save, and that will update the PSD file. There is my PSD file over here. And now I can go to develop. The first thing I'm going to do, which has been driving me crazy, is get rid of the dust spot. That's a huge dust spot, or a huge brush size. So we're going to get that right there. Going to get that right there. Let's hide those. Here's a dust spot. Ooh, I had a noisy sensor. All right, I think I got rid of everything. Now, okay. Alan's asking if the Wacom controls work with all tablets. I know it works with the Intuos 4 and the Intuos 5. I think it works with the Bamboo line as well. You're welcome, Alan. What lens is this? Randy, this is my Canon 15mm fisheye. I used that because I like what it did. It made this look like a book with like a picture. That's you know, now that you asked the question, I kind of remembered why. This looks like a book. So these are like the two sides of the page, and this looks like this window over here looks like it's an image with text. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the tone. I'm going to hit the Option key. So this is important. In Lightroom, I'm in the Develop module over here. Let me bring out the Develops. This slider out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the Option key or the Alt key on a PC. Now when I do that, you see where it says tone over here? It says reset tone. By hitting, now I'm pressing and holding the Option key. When I do that and I drag on these 4 sliders, I'm going to get information. So right here on the highlights, what I'm seeing here is that those dots, the white dots, that's information that's lost. So I'm going to drag that over to the left. And I want to basically get it so that there's no information. I'm going to go to the shadows here. So the shadows, you can see that those are the clipped information. I'm going to drag to the right. I'm not going to go too far. And I'm going to repeat the process for the white point and the black point. So what I've essentially done here is I've gotten myself a properly exposed tone with this HDR image. What this also allows me to do is to continue stylizing. So I can add a little bit of contrast. I can add a little bit of clarity. And I'm pretty much good for now with the overall image. I might drop down the saturation a bit. It's a bit too poppy for me, but I really like what I've got here. And David's saying that it seems like the sky is darker than the sky seen through the window, and that makes sense because you can see it's actually a gradient. It's the gradation that gets brighter from here, and as you go further up, it gets darker. So that if we kind of go, let's go to one of the original exposures. You can kind of see how the sky is brighter over here and it's darker up here. All we did was we compounded that with the tone mapping and with the stylization. If it bothers you, though, David, what you can always do is go back to the Develop module. We can go to the Adjustment brush, and we can kind of select Exposure as our brush. We can bring that up a bit, and then we can start brushing in a little bit of a brighter sky, if it bothers you, type of thing. And so you can even that out accordingly. We can hit New here and make a little bit of a slightly darker brush and even this side out. So you see how you have all of these different options? Ricky, to get to the suite from Lightroom, all you need to do is go to File, Plug in Extras, and there's Perfect Photo Suite, and that's how you send your image. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next image here, because this is one where people want to just do the 32-bit file. So I'm going to take this image. So this is actually a brand new image. I just took this last week. I was on vacation in Tahoe, and this was actually near Donner Lake. I drove past this mechanic shop, and I saw him working on this car in his garage, and I freaked out. I like made a U-turn in the street. I drove back, and I asked him very kindly if I can photograph, and he was awesome. He let me essentially have free run of his shop. He was working, and he's just like, have fun. So I shot this with my Canon 17mm tilt shift lens on my 5D Mark III, which, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like we were talking about earlier, only 7 exposures, Randy. Like you remember you were saying 7 versus 9. My 5D3 does this in camera, so I don't have to worry about it. So what we're going to do is let's select these images here. I'm going to go to File, Plug in Extras. We'll go to Photomatics, except we're going to do Show Intermediary 32-bit HDR image. That's the 32-bit file that people are asking about. Let me just change the file name here. Output format, let's just do a 16-bit TIFF. And so what will happen is when it sends the image to Photomatics, what we should see first is a 32-bit intermediary file. So here's the file. This is a 32-bit file. You see how it just kind of looks really bad? That's because our displays aren't calibrated to show 32-bit images. We actually have to tone map it down to 16-bit. But I can go to File, Save As. We'll put this on the desktop for now. Let me just call it. And we have a file format here, so I'm going to keep it as a Radiance file. I'll save it to the desktop. I'm going to close this, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take File Add, or File Import Photos. I'm going to add from the desktop. Where's my users? I need to browse. Why is my users folder coming down? Or you know what? Give me a second. I'm just going to drag. Here's the file. I'm going to add it here. Huh, why is it not wait, what version of Lightroom? This is 4.1. Let me try using a different file format. Maybe I need to use a different file format. So let me do this again then. Because it should be able to import that. Again, I never tested this yet. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to send this back, and we're going to save it as a different file format. 32-bit, let's just export it. Because now I'm curious. Oh, it needs to be a TIFF? Okay, thanks, Martin. So Martin's saying we need to save it as a 32-bit TIFF file, which we can do. File, Save As. Floating point TIFF. Back to the desktop. Save. Floating point. Yep, that's fine. There's my TIFF file. Recognized. Import. Okay. So here's our file. Let's go to the Develop module. Now, remember I mentioned how with histograms, as you go to the right, this is your white point, your highlights. So we're significantly bunched, which means we need to drag those highlights down. Let's increase drop shadows, exposure. So what we're doing is we're kind of getting the exposure. See how we're getting that information? What I'm basically doing is I'm correcting for proper tone. And this is pretty much your file, which I'm really glad we're doing this now, because what we're going to do is, Hank, we're tone mapping in Lightroom. Essentially is exactly what we're doing. With Lightroom 401, they brought this information here. Now what we can also do is we can use the actual histogram here. So I can drop the highlight information, I can bring out the light information, bring out the darks, and bring up the shadows a bit. So we have here basically a tone mapped image. Now what I want to do for experimentation is I want to go and I'm going to take my tone mapping in Photomatic. I want to see the difference between the two now. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to just put this out as, I'll just put it as a JPEG. I want to see what the difference in quality is between the two. So I'm going to tone map now using Photomatic. So here we go. Right off the bat, I like what I see better. I mean, just right off the bat. I'm going to bring up the luminosity a bit. I'm going to bring up the gamma a tiny bit. Drop down the lighting adjustments a tiny bit. Detail contrast will drop down. So here's my final image. Going to hit save and re-import. Let me take this image and I'm going to drag it over to that folder. Okay, so let's compare the two, just for people who are curious. So on the left is the tone mapped image in Lightroom, and on the right is the tone mapped image with Photomatic. And so let's kind of scroll around. Overall, it's a pretty consistent look. Actually, some of the detail on the Lightroom side, it looks better. Especially on this grill right here, the detail looks better. However, I kind of like the way the highlights were handled in Photomatic over, oops, sorry, going too fast. See the highlights here look a bit unnatural. They look a bit muddy, where here the highlights look natural. So that's one of the things that might be problematic. But overall, clinically, it looks pretty good. So there are the two differences. However, you can see now that, and I want to, Martin, thank you for the tip about making it a floating point TIFF file. That's apparently what Lightroom will use. So don't, you might freak out. Again, let's kind of, because I want to make sure that people understand this. This is the Lightroom file that we had. Now I'm going to go to the develop module. Let me full screen this. I'm going to reset what we did. So this was, if you remember, this is kind of what we came at. This is your 32-bit file. Don't freak out, primarily because by default your exposure is way off. So all I did was I brought that exposure down, and all of a sudden we now have this information. You can see the histogram is chock full of detail. You can also still see that we still have a huge spike in the highlights. So that's where I'm going to drop the highlights. Now watch, you see how as I'm dragging the highlights down, that is this little bunch up is going down. So watch, keep dragging it. Oh, there we go. We've essentially removed it from bunching up. Same thing with the shadows. Shadows on the left. It's all a pulley system is really what it is. But now we can take this file. Let's take this and we'll send it over to Perfect Photo Suite and we'll stylize it. Yeah, Wayne's saying Lightroom will look sharper, and you know what? Does Lightroom add sharpening to the tone mapping, Alan? I don't think by default, Alan. That's a good question. Kevin, I see your question. It's a good question. Let's do some stylization, and then I will attack it when we get back into Lightroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the Perfect Photo Suite, and the first thing I'm going to do in effect is go back to Movie Looks, and I'm going to apply Blue Dawn, one of my all-time favorite effects. I'm going to go ahead here and drop that strength down to 0. And bring it up here. I'm just kind of playing around. Like I said, I just took this image, so I'm kind of working on it the way I would as if I were at home. I'm going to hit blending options, and let's see what the blending modes of multiply, soft light, and hard light do. Let's see what multiply does as I add. Soft light, hard light. I like soft light. So I'm going to keep Blue Dawn, but I'm going to add it to soft light. And then the next thing I'm going to do is hit add. And I'm going to go ahead and I want to accentuate the woody, this kind of warm color. by going to the photo filters category. Here's an effect that I think, oh wait, no, it's not under photo filters. It's under landscape. Here. It's under landscape. It's the last effect, and I don't know how many people ever even see it, but it's called Vecchio. And I love this effect. I really do. I love what it does to the image. I'm going to bring down the strength to 0, bring it up a little bit, and then I'm going to take my masking brush, just like we did before with the tonal contrast. I'm bringing up the inspector, and I'm hitting invert. And what that does is it allows me to paint in that Vecchio effect exactly where I want it. So I'm just kind of painting it up here in these fiberglass insulation bags. And I'm going to paint it along the wall here because it's, I might just to save, oh no, I'll leave it like that. But I will paint it on his mechanic's jacket and just anywhere I see exposed wood. Because I really like that. And to play off of that, I'm going to hit add. I'm going to go to the movie looks and I'm going to apply probably I Got the Blues, but in a very small amount. So watch, let's bring this down to 0. Let's bring it up a bit. And you see how the color of the car is taking this tinny look? I'm going to go ahead, go to the masking brush, invert it again, and I'm going to paint it just on the car, kind of on the chassis. Because I'm a big fan of playing off of tone and off of temperature. I love doing that, making something warmer and then another part, make it cooler. I'm just going to paint this, make sure I get the grill. We ended up spending about 2.5 hours in this guy's garage. I'm emailing with his wife. Once I get these images finalized, I'm going to send him prints so that he can hang them in his garage because it was so nice of him to open up the garage, to me and my friend Karen. All right, I'm going to hit add. I'm going to go ahead and go to the glow category and add a deep forest glow, one of my favorite effects as well. Bring that down to 0, and then just a tiny bit. You don't need that much. And I'm not actually going to change the blending modes. The last thing I'm going to do is just like before, go to add, go to color and tone, and go to the tonal contrast. For tonal contrast, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up, you see the local contrast slider? This is what gives the image texture. The more of that local contrast I give, the more texture there is. So I'm going to bring this down to about 60%. I'm going to bring up the shadows. So this shadow slider brings out shadow detail. So the darker parts of the image get brighter. The next thing I'm going to do is bring the strength of that overall effect to 0. I always do that. I always bring the strength to 0 and I bring it up to about, in this case here, 48, 49%. Hit the invert button. And I'm essentially just going to add texture to the car. The tire, I have to make sure I get that rear tire, as well as the engine block and the grille. Because I want that to really kind of stand out. Hit apply. And hit save. So here's our image in Lightroom. This was our original image. Here we have the perfect effects image. And so someone asked a question about what I was doing with the Alt key and these sliders. So the Alt key, the only thing the Alt key does, or the Option key, when I hit these 4 sliders, is it shows me the actual black and white points instead of showing me the image. I can take the highlight slider and I can drag it up. I can drag it down. That's fine. But watch what happens when I press the Option or Alt key. You see these dots? If I drag it up, when you start to see these shapes, all these colors, that's indicating that you've lost information. What you want to typically do is adjust the slider left or right so that until you see barely any dots, something like that. Same thing with the shadows. So that right there is showing me that in those areas, I've lost information. So I'm going to bring the shadows to the right, and you can start to see how those dots are going away. But watch, I'm not going to bring it all the way to the right because look, you kind of lose all of that shadow information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself, I'll start at 0, and I might just bring it up a tiny bit. You don't need to bring out that much. Shadows are important. We don't want to get rid of shadows. White point, same thing. White point's pretty much spot on. So I'm kind of adjusting that accordingly. Actually, I'm going to bring that down. And then black point, same thing. And so here is our properly exposed image as far as tone goes. I'm going to go ahead and drop the exposure down a bit, boost the contrast, boost clarity overall, and then boost a little bit of the vibrance. And so here we've got our image. What I might also do is add a little bit of a post-crop vignette, a tiny bit, so that the eye comes kind of towards the engine block and the grille. And so this is looking pretty cool. I still have more work that I would do on it, but I think it gives you an idea. And I actually am really glad that we had the opportunity to play around with the tone mapping in Lightroom. It's something that I've been wanting to do, but I never really, tried. And this was only since Lightroom 4.1. That was a new feature that they added. It is like night and day, Alan. That is for sure. What do the blending modes do, Nicholas? The hard light, soft light, they control how the one effect blends with the effect below it. Some soft light or hard light or luminance will determine, or lighter or darker determines which pixel information blends through. So the best thing to do is just what I usually do is I'll just hover over them, to do what they want. Both Hank and George ask similar questions. Hank's asking, what happens if I want to sell a print like this? Well, if I wanted to sell a print like this, I would probably go for a property release, which is what George asked, if I got one. And the answer is no. I didn't get a property release because I'm not planning on selling this image. This is more just for my portfolio. I'm not, if I even end up using it. This was more because I saw the shots, and I'm a big fan of trading access for images. He's not going to do anything with the images. It's more of a thank you gesture for letting me shoot his vehicle and his garage. He opened the garage up to me. So no, I didn't get a property release because I'm not a stock photographer. I don't really need any of the property releases. If I were a stock photographer and I wanted to shoot this, I absolutely would, except to be fair, if I was a stock photographer, I couldn't do anything here because the tire has labels on it. So that's right off the bat. I can't do that. I would never be able to sell an image with BF Goodrich on there. I have a bunch of labels back here in the background. I'd have to kind of turn around or tape up. So this right here is just not a good, you can even see right there, ProTech, oil filter. Can't do it. So property releases would have been the only thing. What make and model of the truck, Ron? Oh man, that's a good question. I texted it to my friend when we were here, but I don't remember. It's a Ford. I think it's a Ford truck. Give me 1 second. Oh, I don't have it. I thought I did. That's that. Yeah, Wayne's saying try to use Kodak Metallic. Totally. I'm thinking a metal print would look really awesome here. I think it would really shine. So let me go ahead here. Before I move on to the next image, I want to see if we have any questions. Jeanette's asking, does the Alt key work in Adobe Camera Raw? I think it does, Jeanette. I don't know if anyone out there who uses Camera Raw. You know what, John? John's saying it's a 36 Ford. I think you're actually absolutely right. I think it's around there. So if anyone here uses Adobe Camera Raw, can you confirm whether using the Alt or Option key will work on the tone sliders? That would help for Jeanette, because I don't use Adobe Camera Raw. I would like to think it does. They're doing a better job of making parallel functionality. Yes, Doug confirmed it. Doug, thank you very much. It does work, and Ann as well. Bracketing quantity. Thank you, Kevin. I knew I was forgetting a question. I remember Kevin asked a long question. Now I'm trying to find it. That's the problem with the questions module, is that, here we go. So here's what Kevin asked. He said, since the more files, the greater the memory required and slower the processing time, is there an inherent need for brackets that are redundant or useless in the info they provide? For example, often your lightest and darkest brackets do not have any information. So basically what Kevin is asking is this. Where's the point of diminishing returns? I assume that's what you're asking, right, Kevin? You know, is there a point at which there's just, you don't need all the brackets? So let's see if I can find an example here. In all honesty, Kevin, you know, it's a valid argument. Watch, I'm going to take these two images and we're going to cycle between them. So here's image 1, image 2. Oops. So is there a difference between the two? Or, you know, really all the exposure information is right here, image 1 and image 2. I would be willing to bet that just by using one of these two, either one, you'd be fine. There isn't that, I haven't noticed with my computer that much of a tax on performance by sending 7 versus 9. I will say that on the brighter, I'd rather have more information on the darker exposures than the brighter exposures. So an exposure like this, I could even stand to use it a little bit brighter. So, you know, it's really a matter of the exposures you get. Sometimes I need more than 9 if it's shooting directly into the sun, for example. So that's basically, I think, where I stand there. You know, I'll oftentimes look at the exposures and see, do I need all of them? So here, you know, this and that. Do I need them? Yeah, I would take both of them because there's difference in tonality in both examples. And when you're going on, so if you're doing tone mapping, it goes pixel by pixel on every single image you send. So by feeding it, in my opinion, more images with more pixel information, it has more data to extrapolate when it's kind of combining them together. And Manny's, I agree with Manny 100%. Manny simply says it must depend on the dynamic range of the scene. Absolutely. That's exactly right. If the scene doesn't have that much of a dynamic range, you might not need as many images. However, if the scene has a very strong dynamic range, you might need more. Like, for instance, this scene here overall doesn't have a great dynamic range except for when you bring in this light bulb. The light bulb has a massive shift in dynamic range, and you can see we're actually missing information. You should be able to see that strip separating the two, kind of like over here. You see how you see the two different ones? So let's go into my darkest exposure. This right here is my darkest exposure. Do you see the problem? My problem is that I didn't expose enough, meaning I didn't get enough exposures to expose for the brightest part. Normally, I'm actually pretty good on that. I'm pretty on top of that. And I think maybe because I felt like I didn't want to annoy the mechanic dude, I didn't want to spend too much time. But normally, I'd look at this exposure, and if my camera read that it was overexposed still, I would have adjusted. You can see actually in the shadows both of the bulbs, because the shadow is acting like a neutral density filter. It's actually cutting it in the reflection. And as a result, the tone-mapped image doesn't have that information. Actually, that's not a tone-mapped image. This is the tone-mapped image. You see how it has the information in the shadow, but it doesn't have it in the actual image. So again, it comes with time and experience. What's the size of the final image, David? Of the tone-mapped one? So of the tone-mapped one, the final size is right here. It's 68 megabytes. The Photoshop file is, or the stylized image is about double that, 137 megabytes. Now again, these are JPEGs. I'll tell you straight off the bat, my RAW files usually weigh in at about a gigabyte a pop when I'm done, when all is said and done. Chris is saying my Canon only brackets 3 pictures. Should I go 2 f-stops then? Chris, there are a few things you can do. If you're only going to do it in one session, in one 3 exposure session, yeah, just do 2 exposures, because that will give you the kind of biggest swing. But there are ways to kind of do it so that you could, depending on your camera, you can do one series of 1 stop and one series of 2 stop, and then you get a greater, it's not as abrupt of a swing. How much RAM do I have and what's my speed? This is a 16 gig RAM. This is a 3.4. This is the latest generation iMac that I'm using. So it's fast. How do you determine the ISO and white balance? Great question, Ron. ISO is pretty much always at 100 unless it's a really dark scene and I don't have a lot of time. I'll bump it up to 400 or even 800 given the camera. 5D Mark III can handle ISO 800 like a champ. But I'm usually 95% of the time I'm at ISO 100. And then the white balance, I usually shoot a color checker passport. I actually did shoot one. We did a webinar with X-Rite last week where I actually had my color checker right here, and I white balanced off of that. I didn't do it for this webinar because I forgot. So I'm actually running out of time. I have a third image that we can save for next time of the snow tunnel. I kind of like the way it looks here, but we'll do it. We'll do it next month's HDR webinar in July. But before we end, I just want to see if there are any last-minute questions. Yeah, Frank's saying you can change the exposure compensation as well, and that's absolutely true. You can do that, but for me, Frank, I try to minimize any contact with the camera in between brackets because the camera shouldn't be moving, and sometimes depending on your tripod, depending on the plate that your camera has connected to your tripod, you might introduce the slightest bit of shake, or you might move the camera while adjusting the exposure compensation dial. Thank you, everyone. Where did you merge the 7 images in Lightroom? I didn't. So Wayne, let's do this one more time. We'll do it with this image here, because I think it's important. What Wayne wants to know is, how did I merge the 7 images? All right. I take these 7 images here. Wait. Oops. There we go. These 7. I'm going to Photomatics, and we're going to use the Lightroom method again. Partly because I'm curious myself. I'm going to go to Photomatics. You want to make sure that you show the intermediary 32-bit image. We'll put it out as a TIFF and export. What camera? This is a 5D Mark III Canon. Do I use mirror lockup between images, Nicholas? Great question. Yes and no. I use mirror lockup pretty much only if I'm shooting at night. I don't really need it during the day. Because usually during the day, there's enough light where I'm not worried about the mirror, when the mirror flaps up and down to introduce shake. At night, I do worry about that. Okay, so here's my 32-bit file. I'm going to go to File, Save As. This is in Photomatics. We're going to save it. This is key. Let's save it to the desktop. Going to change the file format to floating point TIFF. And we're going to say Save. And then Save again. And close. All right, so now we're going to go to File, Import. Go to the desktop. There's my file right here. I'll import it. I'm going to move it to this folder here. Okay, so there is my tone map file. I'm going to go to Develop, and I'm going to bring down the exposure. I'm going to hit the Option key so I can see my exposure, and basically dragging it down until there's nothing showing. Then I'm going to bring my highlights up, actually let me bring up the exposure here. Okay, let's bring down the highlights a little bit more. Shadows, let's bring that up a bit. White point, bring that down. Black point, bring that up. And now let's make it a little bit brighter. And so this is your properly exposed image according to Lightroom. I actually have room to bring out the highlights a bit more. And what I'm doing is I'm looking over here at the histogram. I can bring up the lights a bit, make it a bit brighter overall, bring out the shadows a bit. And so here's the image. So we can compare. Let's compare these 2 images together. So on the left here, this is an original exposure. And then on the right, this is the tone mapped image using Lightroom. And so you can see overall, there's better detail in the corrugated metal. And we have better detail going through the corridor. We also have a little bit more detail. You see how here we have a larger amount of lost information in this first sunny area? We have more detail here than with the tone mapping. Did I apply deghosting? No, Frank, because the camera was on tripod. I didn't need to do, and there was nothing moving. Will Magic Lantern work on 7D? I don't think it does. I'm not 100% sure. Donald, I don't know if Aperture does this. I don't know well enough whether Apple Aperture supports the tone mapping that Lightroom does. So yeah. Time to reprofile my screen. It shouldn't be. I just reprofiled it last week. I don't know why my one's showing that. Oh, you know what it is? It's not this. My main display that you're seeing is profiled. You don't see my secondary display. That wasn't profiled because it's just like my admin machine. Oh, great. Hank asks, man, Hank, I love you. Hank asks a really good question, and he brings up a really good point. So let's go here. What Hank is asking is, when I hit the Option key and I see this information here, what Hank is saying is, all right, so using the Option key is not always what looks good. Meaning, technically, the highlights, I can bring it all the way down here, which is what would be correct. Doesn't necessarily translate to a good-looking image. So what I do is I bring it to where I don't see any dots, and if I say, you know what, this looks really flat, I'll bring the highlights back up, even if it's at a loss of information. This is just kind of a guide for me. You know, technically I can bring the shadows up all the way, but you can see how we have a loss of information, or it just kind of doesn't look good. I like shadows. So Hank, it's a great question. So I would override, absolutely, absolutely. Do you have any HDR adjustments in Photomatics before? I did, Richard, in the first image. So Richard's asking if I did anything in Photomatics. In Photomatics with this image here, I did the tone mapping to get this look. But and actually, you know what? Let's do this really quickly. I'm really intrigued. I'm gonna go and do the tone mapping in Lightroom this time. So we'll go here. We'll export it. This shouldn't take long. We'll create the 32-bit file, and we'll compare it again. So here's my 32-bit file, save as, TIFF to the desktop, close it, and now let's go to File, Add, desktop, there's my image, hit Import, drag it to this folder here. Okay, so right off the bat, here's my image. This is, you know, freak someone out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by bringing the highlights down. At this point, that's too much. Oh, you know what? Let's do the exposure first. Ah, here we go. So you start to see how we're getting information. Now I can adjust the highlights. See, kind of getting it till we don't see anything. Shadows, bring it up a bit. The white point, bring that down a bit. Black point, bring it up a bit. And exposure I might bring down a tiny bit more. It's too much. Let's bring up the highlights. No, let's actually bring up the lights. Okay, so this is probably close to an evenly exposed image. Let's compare the tone mapping in Lightroom versus Photomatics. So on the left is Photomatics, and on the right is Lightroom. Again, personal preference. For me, I do like how Photomatics has the handling of the highlights. It looks a bit more natural, actually, in Photomatics. Or in Lightroom, rather. What I do like most here, though, is I like having more shadow information than I do have here. What's a floating point TIFF? It's the file format. It's the 32-bit file format that Lightroom supports to do this tone mapping. So, you know, we've got this image here. I can continue. You know, for me, it's a bit dark, and that could just mean I can bring out the shadows a bit more. There we go. There we go. Okay, so that's where we start getting more shadow information. And I can adjust the exposure accordingly. Oops. So, you know, we can take it from here, but this is actually pretty convincing. Now I can bring up clarity a bit. I can bring up contrast. I can warm the overall image up. Actually, I like it cooler. So that's kind of where we're at. Cool little example, little experiment that we were able to do. Yeah, the contrast did add a little bit, Wayne. And I agree, Hank is saying that the Lightroom tone mapping is sharper right off the bat. I agree. So always fun learning something new. I'm glad we actually had the opportunity to test that out.